My name is Anne Sudaka. I'm honored to present to you changes in degree of control. I will start with part one. Part one focused on identifying the nature of the change and the implications of that change in terms of financial reporting. Previously, when we were dealing with consolidation or accounting, a parent would acquire a subsidiary or an associate in one transaction and could carry over throughout the consolidation with the same interest. Whereas now, after acquisition of that subsidiary or associate or IFRS 9, there are a number of things that could happen that could cause change. As an example, there could be a disposal or dilution of interest by parent to NCI through sale, or by parent or by NCI through share buyback to acquiree, which you call indirect. Or sometimes it could be an acquisition of interest from NCI by parent, or rather acquiree where parent acquires from acquiree through new share issue or rights issue or conversion by either parent or NCI or both. Hence, the effect is what we call crossing the accounting boundary. If it's acquisition, it's in the seen, the accounting boundary of IFRS 9, you are moving either over to IAS 28 if you acquire more than 20%, or you're moving from IFRS 9 directly to control if you acquire more than, if you add more interest such that you end up with more than 50%, as well as from associate to control. This is very important only when control is indicated or is based on voting rights. As pointed above again, crossing the boundary can happen through disposals, where you can either be disposing from subsidiary control, which is IFRS 3, IFRS 10, to an associate, or to IFRS 9, or from associate to IFRS 9, in whatever way. Hence, we end up with this matrix where we need to identify the nature of changes in bold. There is what we call step acquisition of control. Step acquisition means there was some acquisition, the acquirer or the parent or the investor was holding something, but they ended up acquiring more. So if you have 5%, which is an IFRS 9 financial instrument, financial asset, and you acquire 60% more, you end up with 65%, or you're 30%, which is significant influence associate, and you bought 40% more. That is step acquisition of control. There's also step acquisition of significant influence on vice versa, on the right side, where control has been acquired in the initial transaction, and any change that happens, the parent or acquirer retains control before and after acquisition or disposal. That is called a change in NCI proportion, or a transaction between shareholders. This is, as an example, where parent had 60%, they acquired 10% more to 70, or they had 80% and they acquired more to 60%. What is most important is that control is absolute. Once you get control, once you're over 51%, or once you have control, and you have whatever change that happens, as long as it leaves you with control, percentages don't matter. What is actually changing that regard is NCI, non-controlling interest. On the contrary, similar change would also happen with an associate. Loss of control is where the control that a parent or acquirer is holding is actually lost. So if you have 65% and you sell your 60% and end up with 5%, which is a financial asset under IFRS 9, that's crossing accounting boundary. Or from 70% to 30%, is also from control to associate. That's the same way a loss of significant influence. And when you lose significant influence, you're either going to control or you're either going to control or from associate to IFRS 9. Now, the next part is that we're going to go through. We're going to try to identify the nature, looking at various transactions and try to determine the implications. If the risk that one has is to misinterpret or identify wrongly the nature, hence you would also wrongly identify the implications of that change in interest. So we've got a number of examples from the module. Example 1. So in example 1, we've got a Moon Limited, which is the acquirer, who purchased 800 over 1,000 shares for $1 each. And subsequent to that, on 30 June, Sparkles, the subsidiary which was acquired, has a rights issue in terms of which each shareholder was entitled to purchase 1 share for each 2 shares held. Moon purchased 50 additional rights from non-controlling interest. All rights were exercised. Now, the most important thing is, what is the implication of the above transaction? So we see that we acquired 80%, 800 over 1,000, which is a subsidiary. Subsequently, a rights issue happened and we exercised our rights. It was 1 for each 2 held. But we also bought a little bit more from non-controlling interest. So the implications has to be properly analyzed through what we call a shareholding analysis, which shows us the implication of change. So before we had the total of acquired 1,000, parent at 800, which is 80%, inside 100%. On the change the rights issue, 1 for every 2, which is half, which means we had 500 more shares added to come up with a total after change of 1.5. Parent also exercised and got 400 rights, which they exercised, and NSA got 100. But parent purchased additional 50 rights from NCI, which means NCI goes down and parent adds. Eventually, parent has got 1,250, whereas NCI is only 250. If we recalculate our percentage voting rights after, parent has got 83%, 83.33% from 80%, whereas NCI has 16.67 from 20%. So before the change, parent had control, which is Moon had control, and after the change, Moon still have control. Since control is absolute, it means that they have control before and after. What is simply changed is that NCI's proportion of percentage has changed from 20% to 16.67%. And change in NCI, so hence the change in this is a change in NCI as parent retains absolute control and is covered under IFRS 10 B96. So it's a B96 change. Example 2. Under example 2, Mineral Limited purchased 80% of the shares in Stars Limited for 2.4 on 1 January 2017. The Moon sold half of its shareholding in Stars Limited for 1.6 million. Now, what is the implication of the above transaction? So you identify that when I'm reading these items, I'm reading where there's only the areas where which implies change. So initially there was 80% in Moon, and they sold half. So what does that mean? So 80%, half of that being sold, which is half of 80, which is 40. So Moon is only left with 40%. Now, from 80% to 40%, if control is determined through voting rights, it means that Moon no longer has control in Stars Limited. That's this change is referred to as a loss of control. As parent lose absolute control, and this is accounted for using the guidance in IFRS B98. Example 3 talks about California Limited, which bought 8% of the shares in Florida. And on 1 January 2008, at which date a further 45% of shares in Florida were acquired. The implication of this change is that we had 30% and we bought more, which is 45%, that means we end up, or California ends up with 75%. This change is called a step function of control and is accounted for under IFRS 3, paragraph 41 to 42. Example 4. Example 4 is a little bit interesting because the change does not result from a transaction, rather it results from an event. So it is very important that when you are analyzing these changes, you need to watch out for changes that are caused by a transaction. A transaction is a real exchange of value of money, either for shares or property, either for shares or something that is tangible. Whereas an event can happen that can tip the control scale from one party to the other. So as an example here, Headlights Holdings, which is HHL Limited, has 80% voting rights in WPL, Wedding Parade. Mr. Titus, the founder, has 20% stake, the founder of WPL. Mr. Titus is unwilling to part with the WPL brand, and upon his retirement, he was granted a veto right over all decisions relating to WPL until his death or permanent incapacitation, at which stage the veto right would lapse. This right gave Mr. Titus power over WPL, even though he did not hold the majority of voting rights. So from just the analysis there, with 80%, HHL seems not to have control. Rather, Mr. Titus with 20% has got a veto right, which if he applies it, he can make or stops all decisions relating to WPL. And this power, veto right, it can only be used as long as he's alive and he is in full capacity or operates in full capacity. Since 2004, Mr. Titus made use of his veto right a number of times, but mostly recently in 2009 to overrule a decision made by the board of directors of WPL to transfer legal ownership of the brand to HHL. Mr. Titus became ill and passed away on the 30th of June 2012. His will was read on 1 September 2012, and in terms of his last will and testament, Ms. Paro received 75% of his shares in WPL, and HHL received the remaining 25%. The fair value of the shares received by Ms. Paro was 700,000. What is the implications of the above? So it is very important to note that there is change, but the change is not arising from transaction, and also the acquisition debt is very tricky in this case. So from an HHL point of view, HHL did not have control. So for us to understand that, let's look at what does veto right mean. A veto right is an official power or right to refuse to accept or allow decision or something. So Mr. Titus having that veto power meant that Mr. Titus was in control even though he was holding 20% of the voting rights. Now, upon his death, 75% was given to his daughter. 75% of his 20, which is 15. HHL got 5%, which is 25% of 20, and ended up with 85%. Now, the veto right lapsed, hence the majority of voting rights would obtain control. So, in other words, when the veto right lapsed because of his death, it therefore means that the control moves from Mr. Titus to HHL at 85%. So this is step acquisition of control as parent obtains absolute control, which is accounted for under IFRS 3. Also note that this additional acquisition of 5% by HHL was acquired for no consideration, and specifically that is accounted for or dealt with by paragraph 43. It is also very important to note that Ms. Paro's fair value of her interest of 15% was 700,000, and using simple proportion, you could actually estimate the fair value of 5%, which was handed over to HHL. And in total, we could then fair value the total 85% using simple proportion. Example 5, also it is a transaction, but a little bit different of transaction. So if it helps, we acquired 80%, 400 of 500 shares in Basel, and into the functional US dollar functional currency. The shares in Basel were acquired at 160 date of incorporation. Basel also had 200 convertible preference shares held by minority shareholders. On 1 January 2012, the minority shareholders converted the preference shares. So this is conversion. So the minority shareholders, which the preference shareholders, they converted. So in other words, there is some change here, and the change is played like this. So before, it was 500 total shares, 400 with parent and 100 with NCI, which is 80% and 20% for NCI. Then there's conversion of preference shares to shareholders. NCI converts is 200 shares, which means we've got now more 200 shares, which gets us total to 700. However, as NCI adds 200 and parent does not add anything. Now, after reconsidering our percentage interest of voting rights, 400 over 700 will give us 57.14%, whereas NCI is now 42.86 from 20%. What is most important to note here is that parent still has control. They're 80%, now 57%. And since control is determined by voting rights, parent has got absolute control despite the change in percentage. What this therefore means is that there's a change in NCI because NCI moved from 20% to 42% and control remained in absolute terms. And therefore this transaction should be accounted for under B96. Next, we're going to go to part 2, where we now deal with how to account for a step acquisition of control when it arises under IFRS 3, paragraph 41 to paragraph 43. Thank you.